G'day everyone, welcome back to the channel. So today's video is all about ankle impingement, and there are a few things that I want to get across in today's video, mainly two really helpful exercises that I find to help relieve the symptoms, but also to potentially get to some of the underlying causes of that ankle impingement. The second thing is to make sure that we have a conversation about why a lot of modern ankles tend to impinge, but I think more importantly, above all else, if you're someone who has found this video because you have an impinging ankle, there's every chance that someone has spoken to you about surgery. And I think it's really important to get across that there are far too many people who end up having surgery for an ankle impingement that could potentially have avoided that if you picked up on a couple of the hidden things that go on with an impinging ankle. So I want to make it really clear that there are absolutely a subgroup of people that surgery is potentially the only thing that's going to help in terms of shaving away maybe a bony growth, those osteophytes or something like that, where the joint has physically changed to a point where no amount of exercises or mechanical improvements will ultimately change that. And for those small group of people, surgery is potentially a really noble cause to restore some form of normality to that joint, unimpinge the ankle and help you get free of those symptoms indefinitely. But there's far too many people beyond that that end up having surgery that potentially should have or could have avoided surgery if they picked up on some of these hidden mechanical issues that we're going to go through today. So if you're one of those people, let me know in the comments below, where are you at with your ankle impingement? Have you just had surgery? Are you hoping to avoid surgery? Have you just been diagnosed with ankle impingement and you're looking for some things to work on? I'd love to know in the comments below, just so I can make these videos as specific to you guys as possible. And if you're going to enjoy the information that I'll go through in a second, I'd really appreciate you leaving a like on the video to let me know, but also to subscribe to the channel if you're new and if you enjoy this kind of information, because I would really love for this channel to turn into something really special and to help as many people as possible, because I try and base it on the conversations that I have with my patients day to day. And I have the philosophy that if I have this conversation with one person in this clinical setting, there's every chance that there's hundreds, if not thousands, if not tens of thousands of people wondering the same thing, or that could at very least benefit from that same information. So the more help I can get to grow the channel, the better. So I'd appreciate that. With that being said, I think when we're talking about ankle impingements, as most of you will know, an impinged ankle is basically when you dorsiflex the ankle for a lot of people, and that those bony surfaces contact and become a little bit sore, tender, irritated. Potentially there's a bony block there that every time you reach a certain range, it jams up and irritates that ankle. And we know that if there's some bony abnormalities in there, that over time that can start to sort of chew up the inside of that joint and leave you open to something like arthritis. But the big thing I think gets missed in a lot of this is, as I sort of mentioned briefly to start with, we often assume that those bony abnormalities are either congenital or have just happened out of nowhere. And that sort of feeds this idea that in order to fix impingement, we need to have surgery to remove that. And while that is really true for a number of people, as I said before, there's a huge amount of people where there's more to that story than I guess appears on the surface. And much like hip impingements, which I think is a very similar idea that I see, or a similar issue that I see in the industry, where we often feel like that anatomical restriction is unavoidable or not preventable in a lot of ways, and that surgery is the ultimate sort of way to fix that. But what we tend to find a lot is we often tend to find that an ankle that impinges is also one that's very stiff, or that has a capsule that's very tight, an ankle capsule that's very tight. And this is really important because with the ankle, as the ankle bends, and you can see this, so as the ankle bends, we really need that tibia to slide back or to roll back as the knee comes over the top to maintain some of that congruency with the ankle itself. So the bones underneath that talocrural joint, that talus, as the tibia sort of rolls over the top as the knee bends forward, if you're very stiff at the back of the joint or very stiff at the front of the joint, then it can impede the ability for that tibia to slide back into the joint and avoid the impingement at the front. Now, a lot of people can also impinge on the inside of the ankle. It's the same idea. So instead of it being able to roll back and clear, it sort of gets stuck a little bit and jams up at a certain range. And it'll be no surprise to those who follow this channel a lot, but there's one really effective ankle mobility exercise that everyone has to try with an ankle impingement to see how much mobility they can get back into that joint, and see that instead of, if there is a little bit of a bony lip there on that talus as the joint sort of rolls through and catches, if we can reposition the joint a little bit better, feed a little bit more slack into the joint, then that bony aspect may not necessarily keep impinging. And as long as you maintain that really good capsular mobility, that ankle mobility, and we'll get to one of the causes of this in a second, then you should be able to maintain some really good clearance there and stop that from impinging. So I think the ultimate goal for people with ankle impingement is obviously, in a perfect world, to make that, that bony growth or that lipping decrease so that we can clear it. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we can't do other things to improve the motion at that joint and hopefully get everything to be loaded up properly. So the first thing that I want you guys to do, and again, we always want to make sure we do a test and retest. So just make sure, for example, if my left leg is the one that impinges, we want to put you in a position that lets you know exactly how you feel. So if you get to this certain point and you feel that jamming at the front or that pinching on the inside or wherever you tend to get it, just remember how that feels, because what we want to do is we want to do the banded ankle stretch. So it uses these bands, the power bands. You can do it with TheraBands, but you need to pull them really tight. So what we want to get you to do basically, and again, I'll do it from the side as always, but we want the band pulling back to begin with. So essentially you're facing this direction, but I'll turn side on for the camera. You want to step past it. You want to drop your back ankle down as far as you feel comfortable. Now, if it impinges at a certain end range, and that's really uncomfortable for you, then come off that a little bit. So we want to try and find a position where you can feel some tension or some pressure deep at the back of the ankle without jamming up at the front. So for me, for example, if I go right towards the end of my range, it feels a little bit uncomfortable. So if I come off a fraction, I can still feel a little bit of the tightness at the back. I'm not getting that heavy sort of jamming up at the front. And then I just want to stay here. So you can oscillate in and out of that if you feel comfortable and it feels safe symptomatically. But we want to stay here and let the band pull the joint back into the socket, allowing that stretch to happen at the back and hopefully giving us some more clearance at the front of the ankle. So again, if we can spend 30 seconds here, a minute, 2 minutes if you can tolerate it, you can come out of it and get back into it again if you want to. The other thing that we want to make sure that we do, particularly if you impinge on the inside of that ankle, is we can have the band pulling on the inside. So essentially it's pulling the ankle inwards. Now this is a bit of a bad position in a lot of cases. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that when we bend this ankle that we're not letting the knee cave in. We're actually trying to let it go outwards, externally rotating the leg, lifting the arch up, putting it in a good position and stretching it with the band pulling on the inside of the ankle. And again, this can be a really good way to open up the joint in a position or in a capacity that's often very stiff for a lot of people. So again, once you've done that, hopefully what you'll see, and again, I've done both ankles here, but hopefully what you'll find is the position that jams up for you will hopefully be further into your range than what it was before. So there's every chance that if you're someone who's had an ankle impingement for a long time, there's going to be a hell of a lot of restriction, hidden restriction, asymptomatic restriction in that ankle that needs to be sort of released and mobilized for you to sort of give yourself the best understanding of how much range you can restore to the ankle and whether you can bypass any bony growths or any bony issues that might be squarely contributing to that. So, and as I was saying, in a lot of cases, this stretch alone can take away the need for surgery for a hell of a lot of people with ankle impingement, because even if your x-ray or your scan doesn't look perfect, if the tissue isn't moving correctly, then you can't necessarily tell what the absolute cause of that is. Now, if you restore that normal motion, you work on this for a few weeks, you're making all the progress in the world with your mobility, but at the end of the day, the jamming up still feels the same, then you can at least say, look, maybe surgery is something that I might need to look into. However, when we compare it, or when we add in these other sort of few little bits and pieces, there's potentially more that you can try to see if you can avoid that, or at the very least, if you haven't spoken about surgery, conquer that impinging sensation in ways that you may not have thought you could before. So the next thing that I want to get you guys to think about is, so once you're working really hard on trying to free up that ankle joint capsule with the banded ankle stretch, we want to start to look at some of the soft tissue around the front of the ankle. Now, this often seems a bit counterintuitive because when the ankle bends, when we dorsiflex the ankle and it bends, it makes more sense that the tissue at the back, when that gets restricted, it doesn't allow that sort of lower leg to translate backwards and clear the front. But if you're also very tight through the tissue at the front of the ankle, it can still hang on and jam up the front of the ankle as well. So one of the things that I want you guys to do, and you can do this with the ball, but just for the purposes of this, I'll use my thumbs to begin with. So we're looking at that tibialis anterior tissue. So the tissue that sort of runs through the front outer part of your shin, down through the front of the ankle into the foot. Now, basically we want to get you to find the malleolus, the bone at the side of the ankle, and the other one on the inside, sort of in the middle of those two bones. I just want you to jam your fingers in there. Now again, it may be a little bit tender, but what I want to get you guys to do is compress that tissue, and it'll get you to bend and flex your ankle. And what you might find is that there's some gristly tissue under there. Again, apologies if it feels tender, just go as hard as you feel comfortable. But we're using this active release technique to try and shear free the tendons, the fascia, any connective tissue that's under here that might be a bit restricted and a bit glued down. While you're pushing in through the front here, you can also jam your fingers into the back around that Achilles tendon area. And same thing, when you're bending and flexing that ankle, what you'll find is that you're shearing free all the tissue that might be restricted in that area and ultimately feeding slack to that ankle. Now, you can do the same thing with the ball. Again, this is a lacrosse ball. You can use a tennis ball if you don't want to use your fingers. But what you need to basically do is hold on to the ball, let it press into your ankle, and then same thing, make circles, bend it backwards and forwards, go looking for tissue that feels restricted beyond what it should, and then you can maneuver it around, move the ball around, looking for those angles that feel like they need to be released. And again, the front of that shin, that tibialis anterior, a lot of the connective tissue, soft tissue at the front, also gets glued down and can contribute to that impinging sensation. So once you've done that, again, if you retest it, so for me personally, it feels like that, any of that jamming sensation, and I only get a slight jamming sensation, seems to have disappeared. And hopefully you can see on the video, and please feel free to rewind this to check yourself, but it just feels like I can go further now than what I could before. Now, again, we want to make sure that the deep capsule's loose and any of the soft tissue around the front specifically, also the back as well. You can do the same thing around the back. But what I want to make sure you guys can get to is you want to be able to do this while sitting on the ball, essentially. This is a really high level of function. It's not for the faint-hearted, but it's definitely for those who want to really make some progress. So if you can get into this position, so again, you do need some plantar flexion mobility to get here, but if you can sort of gently, so I've got most of my weight on my arms, and I'm just maneuvering the ball around to try and find a spot that feels a little bit tight and tender. Found a nice one there. And then the same thing that I did before, I really want to lift my foot off the ground, shearing that tissue free as much as possible, change the angle, it feels a bit better, and by that I mean it feels a lot worse. But we're trying to find a position that really exposes some of that tightness that you just don't realize is there until you go looking for it. And again, trying to feed as much slack as possible into that ankle. Again, to see if we can improve how that ankle impingement feels, whether there's a bony issue there or not. Excuse me. And then again, making sure you're testing that again. And again, it feels smooth, a lot smoother. So again, from an exercise perspective, excuse me, those two exercises are insanely powerful. They're really effective. They're fast acting. So if you have any ankle impingement, whether it's a new one, whether it's a chronic one, whether you're ready for surgery or not, we want to see how much of an impact that makes so that you can determine how much of your symptoms are just due to a bony abnormality there, and whether surgery is the thing that you need to fix. Interestingly enough, even if you get to a point where surgery is the thing that you have to do because nothing else is helping, post-surgery, you still need to make sure that those two parts of your ankle are functioning really well. Otherwise, you haven't addressed some of the underlying causes of that. So if we take away that bony lip, those bony growths, the tissue that's jamming up in there, but the tissue at the front of the ankle, the tissue at the back of the ankle, that capsule is still really stiff and tight, then you're not necessarily fixing the problem, you're just taking away the obvious symptoms associated with that impingement. So So with that being said, the final thing that I want to leave you guys with is a really important thing to understand about why those tissues become stiff, tight, and sore in the first place. And the thing I think that gets missed a lot, particularly when we're looking at footwear, is that, at least in my experience, a lot of people's ankle impingements aren't genetic or that your anatomy sucks. It's often a product of the modern world, and that dysfunction is developed over a period of time, most likely, at least from what I see, because of that restricted tissue changing the way that you load up the ankle and creating areas that can jam up and do jam up over time. Now, the thing that's really important to understand here is this is just a barefoot shoe. So these are the shoes that I wear to work. These are the shoes that I wear all over the place. I think the biggest issue that we see are shoes that have a heel on them. And if you're looking for the single most important cause of ankles that are stiff and potentially impinge, we're looking squarely at shoes that have a heel attached to them. So we're not talking about a women's heel, like a stiletto or something like that. We're talking about any shoe that isn't dead flat. And that can be, I won't name the brands, but there's basically, they can have a small heel, they can have a huge heel compared to the front of the shoe. Now, the reason why this is really important to understand, because if you're working really hard on the power band exercise, the band ankle stretch, or you're working really hard on trying to free up a lot of the tissue around the ankle, if you stay in shoes that have a heel in them, the size of that heel is the exact amount of ankle range you don't get access to while you're using that shoe or while you're in that shoe. So if your work shoe or recreational shoe has a heel on it, for the entire time that you're in that shoe, you don't get access to that amount of your ankle range. And if you're working really hard on improving your ankle range, it's highly counterintuitive to then spend a lot of time asking that tissue to re-stiffen again. So the important thing to note though is that it's really hard for people to go from a shoe that has a thick heel to nothing overnight, because the mechanical dysfunction that we accrue from being in a heel doesn't go away overnight. But the idea is that if you have a particular shoe that you love and you can progress to a shoe that has a smaller heel, make sure that those ankle tissues are freeing up, and then eventually aim to get into a shoe that is completely flat. Then you can be safe in the knowledge that that ankle stiffness won't return. Now, there's obviously a large debate over barefoot shoes, regular shoes, what's best. And I've got a video on those as well if you want to go into a little bit more detail. But ultimately, if you can't tolerate a barefoot shoe, if you can't run in a barefoot shoe, if you can't walk around in a barefoot shoe, then there's something wrong with your mechanics. There's something that these shoes are exposing that your heeled shoe or your arch supported shoe is buffering and hiding for you. And we know that because when you take those shoes off and walk around barefoot, then if that all of a sudden feels sore, then there's something missing there that you can reclaim, but it's often a hidden thing. So when we talk about ankle impingement, it often goes hand in hand with shoes that have a heel on them. The other thing is flip-flops or thongs, depending on where in the world you're from. They also compromise your mechanics to a large degree. So again, I hope that was really helpful information for you guys. Remember, if you're not going after that hidden capsular stiffness or some of that hidden tissue dysfunction at the front of the ankle, it's really hard to have a really clear understanding of what the true cause of your ankle impingement is. If you have a bony prominence or a bony issue there that's contributing to the jamming up, at the very least go through these exercises to see how much of your discomfort you can change by improving how you load the area, by how it moves and how mobile it is, so that if you do have to have surgery at the end of the day, and again, not everyone has to, but if you do have to, if it's exactly what you have to do, then at least you can be safe in the knowledge that you've optimized everything else, and this is just the final piece of the puzzle that you needed to tweak, so that when you've had the surgery, you can be confident that you've solved that dysfunction as best as humanly possible, as opposed to someone who goes in and has the surgery but is still really stiff and tight everywhere, and they just keep having ongoing symptoms or other problems crop up because that ankle doesn't function well. So as always, if you want to enjoy this video, please consider leaving a like below. Let me know down in the comments what you're thinking, and consider subscribing if you're new. But with that being said, I appreciate you stopping by. Hope that was helpful, and I'll see you next time.